Think about the classroom you grew up in. Rows of chairs. A bell telling you when to arrive. A bell telling you when to leave. One adult at the front. Raise your hand to speak. Sit still. Do not question the order of things. Now ask yourself who designed that room. Not the building, the system inside it. The rows, the bells, the silence. The one adult who held all the permission. Because someone did design it. In 1763, in Prussia, a king named Frederick the Great signed a document that answered that question exactly. He wrote down what children would be taught, how they would sit, when they would speak, and what kind of people they would become when they left. He was not thinking about your future. He was thinking about his. What he put inside that document, and how it traveled from Prussia into classrooms across the world, is what this video is about. This is not just a story about an old European education system. This is a story about a design built to serve a very specific purpose, for a very specific group of people. And the children of the working population were not that group. The ruling class received a different school entirely. The working population received the one that became the global model. And the man who carried it to America in 1843 never made that distinction clear. To understand what happened, you have to see Prussia in 1763. Prussia was a military state. Frederick the Great had spent much of his reign at war. The 7 Years' War had just ended. The country had survived, but the experience sharpened something in the king's thinking. A unified, disciplined population did not appear on its own. It had to be built from the ground up before children were old enough to question the arrangement. His problem was practical. Prussia's population was scattered. Different religious groups ran their own schools. Children across the country were learning different things from different people, with no single thread connecting them to the state. He needed a consistent population, not a curious one, a consistent one. 15 years before the king signed anything, a man named Johann Julius had already drawn the blueprint. Hecker was a clergyman and educator in Berlin. In 1748, he established the first teacher training seminary in Prussia. He designed standardized subjects, age-based grade levels, a trained adult at the front of every room, and a fixed schedule that synchronized every classroom in the country. When Frederick signed the General Landschule Reglement in 1763, he was not inventing anything new. He was making Hecker's design compulsory. Attendance was mandatory. The state would train the teachers. The state would set the curriculum. For the first time in modern history, a government had taken institutional control of childhood. But here is the part that almost nobody tells you. It was not one system. It was three. At the top sat the gymnasium. This was the school for the children of nobles and senior officials. The curriculum covered philosophy, classical languages, rhetoric, and critical reasoning. These children were being trained to think independently, construct arguments, and govern. In the middle sat the Realschule. This was for the merchant and professional class. Technical subjects, applied sciences, practical skills for people who would manage institutions and run businesses. And at the bottom sat the Volksschule, the people's school. The curriculum was deliberately narrow. Basic reading, basic arithmetic, religious instruction, punctuality, the ability to follow instructions without hesitation, to complete assigned work, to arrive when the bell rang and leave when it rang again. These were not three underfunded versions of the same education. They were three different destinations built into the same system. The gymnasium produced the people who would govern. The Volksschule produced the people who would be governed. And historians who have studied the period are clear that this separation was structural, not accidental. The system ran inside Prussia for decades. The king got what he needed: a literate, punctual, orderly workforce. A population capable of completing assigned tasks and producing very few people inclined to question who held power or why. Then, in 1807, something broke it open. Napoleon's army met the Prussian military at the Battle of Jena. The Prussians lost so fast that historians still use the battle as a case study in military collapse. Napoleon entered Berlin. French soldiers stood in Prussian streets. A philosopher named Johann Fichte stood in occupied Berlin and delivered 14 public lectures. He called them addresses to the German nation. His argument was not about military tactics. It was about school. Fichte's position was that Prussia had built a population trained to follow, but not to believe. What was needed, he argued, was education that formed a person's identity before they were old enough to resist the formation. Not information, identity. A citizen who felt the state as part of themselves would not need to be commanded. They would act from the inside out. The structure of the classroom did not change visibly after Fichte. The bells still rang. The children still sat in rows. But the thinking about what that structure was supposed to produce had deepened into something more permanent than obedience. If this is the first time you are hearing about the three-tier design inside the Prussian system, you are not alone. Most people who know this story were only ever told the factory workers' version. The tier separation is the part that was left out. Drop a comment and tell us, which tier did your school feel like? We read every comment and we always reply. Now back to the story. Because the part that connects 1763 to your classroom is coming. And the man who made that connection never explained exactly which tier he was carrying. In 1843, an American educator named Horace Mann traveled to Prussia. Mann was the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. He believed sincerely that America needed a stronger public school system. He studied the Prussian model carefully. He came home with detailed notes and a published report recommending America adopt the system without delay. He described it as the most orderly, consistent, and effective model he had observed anywhere in Europe. He was not wrong about what he saw. But there is a distinction historians have noted in what he brought back. Mann returned with the structural features of the Volksschule, the grade levels, the standardized curriculum, the trained teacher managing a fixed room on a fixed schedule, the system designed to produce a consistent, compliant, task-completing population. He presented this to Americans as democratic education, universal education, education built for everyone. The gymnasium did not travel with it. The philosophy, the rhetoric, the independent reasoning, the curriculum that trained children to question ideas and construct original arguments from scratch, that tier remained in Europe. The tier the ruling class had always used for its own children stayed exactly where it had always been. Whether Mann made a deliberate choice or whether the Volksschule model simply aligned better with what American reformers wanted is a question historians continue to debate. What the record shows is the outcome. The model that spread across American public schools carried the structure of the bottom tier, and the tier that produced independent thinkers was not part of what spread. By the late 1800s, the Prussian shape had moved across American public education. Grade levels, standardized subjects, a single teacher managing a room of students seated in rows, a bell-driven schedule. The design had spread state by state, not through a single decision, but through a series of adoptions that each looked like progress. Then, in 1902, John D. Rockefeller established the General Education Board. Rockefeller was the wealthiest man in America. The board funded schools across the country, shaped curriculum decisions, and influenced teacher training programs on a national scale. The board's reach into American public education was significant and documented. Frederick Gates, Rockefeller's personal advisor and the board's key architect, wrote a statement of purpose that has since entered the historical record. He wrote that the board did not intend to produce philosophers, men of learning, scientists, or men of letters. He wrote that the task was to organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers were doing in an imperfect way, not to help children surpass the previous generation, to replicate it more efficiently. What the board intended beyond that statement is a matter of historical interpretation. What the statement itself says is not. The most influential private education funding body in American history described its goal as producing more efficient versions of the existing workforce, not thinkers who might examine the workforce critically. The Volksschule design, born in Prussia in 1763, had found new institutional support in America. At the precise moment the country's industrial economy needed a large, consistent, manageable labor supply. The structure was already in place. The bells were already ringing. Nobody had to change a thing. The core features of that 1763 design remain visible in many public school systems around the world today. Age-based grade levels, standardized curriculum, one adult managing a room on a fixed schedule, assessment built around recall rather than original reasoning, subjects taught in isolation with no structural connection between them. Whether this represents a direct, unbroken line from Frederick the Great, or a pattern that institutional inertia has simply sustained, is something historians continue to examine. What is harder to contest is the gap. The gymnasium still exists. It operates under different names in different countries. It shows up in elite private institutions, selective programs, and schools accessible to families with the resources or connections to reach them. Philosophy, rhetoric, the ability to construct an original argument. Those subjects are still being taught, just not in the same room as everyone else. The separation that was written into the Prussian system in 1763 between the children trained to think and the children trained to comply was not a gap that closed when the system crossed the Atlantic. It followed it. Here is what this story is really about. Nobody stood in front of your classroom and explained its origins. The teacher was not in on a design from 1763. The building looked like opportunity from the outside. But the structure inside it, the schedule, the rows, the permission system, the narrow curriculum, came from somewhere. It was built for someone. And that someone was not the child sitting in the chair. The most revealing thing about this story is not the king or the philosopher or the American reformer or the industrialist. It is how long the same shape has lasted without the explanation. A design built in 1763 to serve a king's need for a managed population, survived Napoleon, crossed an ocean, got funded by the wealthiest man in America, and became what most of us called a normal childhood. The shape stayed. The reason it was built was never part of the lesson. If this video gave you something to think about that your school never did, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because there are more stories on this channel about the systems that shaped your world before you were old enough to question them.